The morning I woke up to 14 inches of fresh snow burying my car, my driveway, and basically my entire will to live. I had absolutely no idea that by the end of that week, I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office watching Sue Bishop's face turn a shade of red I can only describe as expired beet. But let's back up, because this story really needs to be told from the beginning, and trust me, every single piece of it matters. My name is Frank Sawyer, and I've lived on Cresthaven Drive for going on 11 years now. It's a quiet little street of about 22 houses tucked into the kind of suburban neighborhood that looks like a Christmas card in December and a sauna in July. Nice neighbors, decent-sized lots, mature trees lining both sides of the road. When I moved in, the HOA was barely a blip on my radar. It was the kind of thing that existed mostly to remind you not to park a boat in your driveway or let your grass grow past 6 inches. Annoying sometimes, sure, but manageable. That was before Sue Bishop got elected to the board 3 years ago. Sue Bishop is the kind of person who finds purpose in rules the way other people find purpose in religion. She's probably mid-50s, always wearing one of those puffer vests even in mild weather. Hair pinned up like she's perpetually ready for a PTA meeting that never ends. She moved in about 5 years ago, and within 18 months she'd worked her way onto the HOA board. By year 3, she was effectively running the whole operation while the 2 other board members, Dave Kowalski and Patricia Hinz, mostly just nodded along because neither of them wanted the headache of arguing with her. Sue had a particular talent for finding problems where none existed, then billing homeowners for the privilege of having those invented problems fixed. She'd find my neighbor Rick for having the wrong shade of gray on his mailbox post. She'd gone after the Delgado family for a holiday wreath that stayed up 3 days past her self-imposed deadline of January 5th. She'd sent formal written warnings to the Hendersons about the color of their curtains being inconsistent with community aesthetic standards, a phrase so breathtakingly vague that it could mean literally anything and therefore nothing at all. But I'd stayed under the radar for the most part. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn neat, repainted my shutters when asked. I didn't make waves because, honestly, I had better things to do with my energy than joust with a woman who clearly treated HOA governance as her full-time job and primary source of joy. That all changed in January, during what the local news kept calling the storm of the decade, which I'd normally dismiss as meteorological dramatics, except that this time they were absolutely right. It started snowing on a Tuesday evening. Light at first, the kind of flurries that look pretty through a window and remind you why people romanticize winter. By midnight, it had shifted into something far less romantic. I checked the weather app around 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep, and the sound of wind hitting my windows was genuinely unsettling. And the radar showed this massive green-to-red blob sitting right on top of us with no intention of moving. By Wednesday morning, 14 inches had fallen. By Wednesday afternoon, it was closer to 17. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind chill pushing it to -12. Now, Cresthaven Drive has a specific provision in the HOA rules. The association contracts with a snow removal vendor to plow the street and clear the sidewalks along the common areas. Homeowners are responsible for their own driveways and the sidewalk directly in front of their individual properties. The HOA vendor is supposed to respond within 4 hours of a storm ending or accumulations reaching 6 inches, whichever comes first. This had always worked fine in the past because we'd never really had a storm that tested the system. This storm broke the system completely. By Thursday morning, after the snow had tapered off to flurries and the official accumulation was sitting at 19 inches, our street was completely impassable. I'm not talking about inconvenient, I mean genuinely, dangerously impassable. The snow had drifted against cars and fences. The road itself had a solid foot-plus of packed and drifted snow across its entire width, and the temperature wasn't budging. Nobody could get out. People had jobs to get to. A woman named Carol Marsh, 3 houses down, had a dialysis appointment she absolutely could not miss. Tom Nguyen at the end of the street had been trying to get to his 80-year-old mother's house since the night before because she'd mentioned her furnace was acting up, and with temps at 8 degrees, that wasn't a situation you just waited out. I called the HOA's general contact line Thursday morning at 7 and got voicemail. I left a message. I sent an email through the resident portal. I texted the number we'd been given for urgent maintenance issues, which was apparently Sue Bishop's direct line because she was the one who texted back 45 minutes later saying, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, that the vendor had been notified and was managing multiple properties across the region, and we should expect service within the normal contractual window. I checked the contract language I'd saved from a previous dispute about gutter cleaning charges. The contractual window was 4 hours from when accumulation stopped, which had been roughly 11 the night before. We were already 8 hours past that window and counting. I called 3 of my neighbors. Within an hour, about a dozen people were standing in the street, some in heavy coats and work boots, some just in whatever they'd grabbed on their way out, watching their breath cloud in the frigid air and collectively realizing that nobody was coming. Tom Nguyen was visibly stressed about his mother. Carol Marsh was on the phone with her dialysis center trying to reschedule, which they told her they could only do once before it became a medical issue. The Delgado kids were supposed to be at school, which was the least urgent thing on the list, but representative of how the whole street had essentially been frozen in time. That's when my buddy Marcus Webb, who lives 4 houses down from me, made the call that started everything. Marcus runs a small landscaping business, which means he has connections with equipment operators. He called a guy he knew, a private plow operator named Dale who worked independently and had a truck with a front blade and a spreader. Marcus asked Dale how fast he could get to Cresthaven Drive and what he'd charge to do the whole street, which at our width and length would be a solid hour of work at minimum. Dale quoted a fair price. Marcus came down the street talking to neighbors, and within about 30 minutes we'd passed around a Venmo and everybody on the street had kicked in their share. I put in my portion without hesitation. Tom Nguyen Venmo'd double and left a note saying he'd pay triple if Dale could start at the far end near his house so he could get out first to check on his mother. Dale showed up around noon in this big orange truck with a blade on the front and a salt spreader on the back. And honestly, watching that plow clear our street was one of the most satisfying things I've ever witnessed. He went up and down the full length of Cresthaven twice, pushed the snow to the shoulders, salted the road, cleared around the parked cars as best he could, and by 1:30 in the afternoon people were getting in their vehicles and leaving. Tom Nguyen was out within minutes, tires crunching over freshly spread salt, heading to his mother's place. Carol Marsh made her rescheduled dialysis slot with time to spare. Several people shouted thanks out their car windows as they passed Dale's truck. It felt like a genuine community moment, the kind of thing that reminds you why neighborhoods matter. I went back inside, made a hot coffee, and felt good about the day. That feeling lasted until Saturday. Saturday morning, I went to get my mail and found a notice from the HOA tucked into my mailbox, along with a circular for a pizza place I'd never been to. The notice was on official HOA letterhead, stamped with the Cresthaven HOA seal, and addressed to me personally. It stated that on Thursday, January 14th, a private contractor had been observed performing snow removal services on Cresthaven Drive, which was the exclusive jurisdiction of the HOA's contracted vendor under Section 7.3 of the Cresthaven HOA Community Standards and Maintenance Guidelines. It further stated that by facilitating, funding, or failing to prevent the use of an unauthorized vendor on HOA-managed property, I was in violation of said guidelines and would be assessed a fine of $250, payable within 30 days. $250. for having the street plowed when the HOA's own vendor was 9+ hours past their contracted window and had still not shown up. I stood at my mailbox in the cold, reading this letter twice, feeling the temperature of my blood doing something interesting. Then I walked down to talk to Marcus, who was standing in his own driveway with a nearly identical letter and an expression I can only describe as the face you make when someone spits in your coffee. Marcus had gotten the same fine. So had Tom Nguyen when I called him. So had Carol Marsh. So had the Delgados. I spent about 2 hours on the phone and in the street talking to neighbors, and it turned out every single household on Cresthaven Drive had received a $250 fine notice. All 22 of them. That's $5,500 total that the HOA was trying to extract from our street for the crime of not freezing to death while waiting for a vendor that never showed. What made it worse, genuinely worse, was that the HOA's contracted vendor finally appeared on our street Friday afternoon. Not Thursday, Friday. More than 24 hours after the storm ended and nearly 30 hours past the contractual response window, this beat-up white truck with the vendor's logo on the door came rolling down Cresthaven Drive and made a single pass. One pass, on a road that was already cleared, then left. Whether they were doing it to technically fulfill the contract or just out of some bizarre compulsion, I genuinely couldn't tell you. But the timing was so egregious that several neighbors actually came outside just to stare at the truck in silence as it drove by, like we were watching something from a nature documentary about animals with absolutely no self-awareness. I called the HOA contact line again Saturday afternoon. This time I got Sue Bishop directly, which surprised me a little because I expected voicemail. She answered on the second ring, and her tone immediately set the temperature for the conversation. Brisk, certain. The way someone sounds when they've already decided how a discussion is going to go before it starts. I told her I'd received the fine notice, and I had serious concerns about its legitimacy. I explained that the contracted vendor had failed to appear within the contractual window by a margin of nearly 30 hours. I explained that residents had a genuine safety need, citing Carol Marsh's medical appointment and Tom Nguyen's situation with his elderly mother and the broken furnace. I told her the community had self-organized, paid out of pocket, and resolved a situation that the HOA had failed to address. Sue listened to all of this with the patience of someone who has already made up their mind. Then she said, in a tone that I can only describe as weaponized politeness, that she understood my frustration, but the HOA's maintenance policies existed for important reasons, and that allowing residents to independently contract services on HOA-managed property would create chaos, liability issues, and insurance complications. She said the vendor delay had been caused by extraordinary storm conditions affecting multiple service areas simultaneously, which was understandable and within the vendor's rights under their force majeure clause. She said the fine stood. I asked her to explain the force majeure clause she was referencing. She paused for exactly 2 seconds and then said she'd have to get back to me on the specific language. She never did. I went inside and started doing what I probably should have been doing since the first time Sue Bishop fined Rick for the wrong shade of gray on his mailbox post. I started reading, carefully, with coffee. I pulled up the full Cresthaven HOA Community Standards and Maintenance Guidelines, which I downloaded as a PDF from the resident portal, but honestly hadn't read cover to cover since I moved in. Section 7.3, which the fine notice had cited, did indeed say that snow removal on HOA-managed roadways was the exclusive domain of the HOA's contracted vendor. No argument there. But Section 7.3 also had a subsection, 7.3b, which I'd never looked at before because I'd never needed to. Section 7.3b said, and I'm quoting this from memory because I've now read it about 40 times, that In the event the contracted vendor fails to perform services within the designated response window due to reasons other than documented natural emergency conditions, the HOA shall bear full responsibility for service gaps, and homeowners shall not be held liable for reasonable independent action taken to address safety or access concerns. That subsection was essentially a built-in emergency exception, and it had teeth because of one specific phrase: documented natural emergency conditions. The vendor's force majeure argument only worked if the delay was caused by a documented natural emergency. A bad snowstorm across multiple service areas wasn't inherently a documented natural emergency under the HOA's own definition, which elsewhere in the guidelines defined natural emergency conditions as events declared by the county or state government, including official weather emergencies, states of disaster, or public safety declarations. I checked. Our county had issued no weather emergency declaration for this storm, not one. The county had issued a Level 2 snow emergency, which restricted road travel and required adequate tires or chains, but a Level 2 was explicitly different from a weather emergency declaration. The county's Level 3 designation was the one that would have constituted an emergency under state and county protocols, and the county had never escalated to Level 3 for this storm, which meant the vendor had no legal force majeure protection under the HOA's own guidelines, which meant Section 7(3)(b applied in full, which meant the fines were void. I also pulled up the HOA's vendor contract, which was posted on the resident portal under Documents, and which I'm guessing approximately 0 of my neighbors had ever read. The contract confirmed the 4-hour response window. It also included a specific penalty clause. If the vendor failed to meet the response window without an approved documented excuse, the HOA could withhold payment for that service call and was eligible to recover any additional costs incurred by homeowners as a direct result of the vendor's non-performance. In other words, not only were the fines against us invalid, but the HOA potentially owed the street for the money we'd collectively spent getting Dale to come plow. I printed everything. I made a folder. I labeled it with a sticky note that said evidence, because I watched too many courtroom dramas and I felt like it was the right energy for the moment. Sunday, I sent a group text to the Cresthaven Drive neighborhood group chat, which had been blowing up with outraged messages since the fine notices arrived. I told everyone I'd found something important and asked if people could come over to my place at 2 in the afternoon. I said I'd provide coffee, and I had good news. 16 people showed up. I had to drag extra chairs out of my garage, and it was cramped and cold for about the first 15 minutes until my heating system got ahead of the crowd and the place warmed up. My neighbor Linda brought a coffee cake, which honestly elevated the whole meeting considerably. I walked everyone through what I'd found: the subsection 7(3)(b exception, the county emergency declaration standards, the vendor contract penalty clause. I watched the room shift from the resigned frustration of people who expected to just pay the fine and complain about it, to something sharper and more interested. Tom Nguyen, who is a project manager by trade and approaches everything like it's a logistics problem, immediately started asking questions about documentation and timelines. Carol Marsh asked whether the medical appointment situation created any additional legal exposure for the HOA. Marcus Webb, who'd been the one to call Dale in the first place, asked if the HOA could try to flip the script and claim it was his fault for initiating the private plow. I told them my plan. We were going to send a formal written response to the HOA, signed by all residents who'd received fines, disputing the notices and citing the specific sections of the HOA's own documents that invalidated them. We were going to include a demand for the HOA to recover costs from the vendor for non-performance per the vendor contract, and request that those recovered costs be distributed back to the residents who'd paid Dale. We were going to copy the response to every board member, not just Sue Bishop, And we were going to do it all through certified mail with return receipt, so there'd be a paper trail that couldn't be denied. Tom Nguyen said he'd write the letter if I provided the documentation. He had it drafted by Monday evening, and it was excellent. Clear, formal, well-organized, and devastating in the way that only well-sourced factual documents can be. It cited chapter and verse from the HOA guidelines, the vendor contract, and the county emergency declaration records. It included a timeline down to the hour of when the storm ended, when the contracted response window expired, when residents contacted the HOA and received no adequate response, when the private plow was employed, and when the HOA's vendor finally appeared the following afternoon. Tom added a line at the end that I particularly loved, which stated that residents reserved the right to pursue all remedies available under applicable law, including but not limited to formal complaints to the state HOA Oversight Board and civil action for the unlawful assessment of fines. 20 residents signed it, all of them. Even the Hendersons, who were generally pretty conflict-averse and had asked 3 times whether this would make things worse. I told them the only thing that made things worse was letting Sue Bishop get away with it, and they signed. We mailed it certified on Tuesday. Sue Bishop signed for her copy Wednesday morning. Wednesday afternoon, I got a phone call from Dave Kowalski, one of the other HOA board members. Dave is a retired electrical engineer who's on the board mostly because he got drafted into it at an annual meeting 3 years ago and never managed to get out. He's fundamentally decent, just perpetually outgunned when it comes to Sue. He called from what sounded like a parking lot and spoke quietly, which told me something was happening on the board side that he didn't want overheard. He confirmed that the letter had arrived and that all 3 board members had received copies. He said Patricia Hines had read it and was concerned. He said he himself had read it and was also concerned. He said Sue Bishop had read it and declared it a frivolous nuisance letter designed to intimidate the board. He said there was a board meeting scheduled for the following Monday, and that the fine dispute would be on the agenda whether Sue liked it or not. I thanked him for the heads-up and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether he happened to know what the vendor contract said about the response window penalty. He was quiet for a moment, and then said he hadn't personally read the vendor contract since it was renewed 18 months ago, but that from what he remembered, there was indeed a performance guarantee with financial consequences. I told him I'd be happy to bring a printed copy to the Monday meeting. He said that would probably be useful. The week between sending the letter and the Monday board meeting was genuinely unpleasant in the way that waiting always is. The weather wasn't helping. After a brief thaw that turned the snow into gray slush, temperatures dropped again Wednesday night and everything refroze. The street was manageable because Dale had done such a thorough job, but the sidewalks and driveways were a mess, and half the street was dealing with ice patches that hadn't been properly treated because the HOA's vendor had done one cursory pass on a road that was already clear instead of treating the areas that actually needed attention. Carol Marsh slipped on her front walk Thursday morning. She wasn't seriously hurt, just bruised her hip and shaken up, but it was the kind of thing that could have been much worse, and when I helped her inside and got her settled with some ice, she was furious in a quiet, controlled way that I found more alarming than shouting would have been. She asked me if the HOA's failure to maintain the common sidewalk areas constituted negligence. I said I wasn't a lawyer, but I thought the question was worth asking one. Friday afternoon, Marcus Webb knocked on my door with something on his phone that changed the complexion of the whole situation. Marcus had a security camera above his garage that he'd installed after someone keyed his truck 2 winters ago. He'd never mentioned it in any of the neighborhood discussions because it hadn't seemed relevant until he went back and reviewed the Thursday footage out of curiosity. The camera had a decent field of view that covered the street in front of his house and a fair stretch in both directions. What it showed was interesting. It showed Dale's orange truck arriving and working, which we already knew about. but it also showed something else. On Thursday evening, around 5 in the afternoon, more than 6 hours after the storm had tapered off and well past the 4-hour window, a car had parked briefly at the entrance to Cresthaven Drive. The car sat there for about 2 minutes, then drove away without entering the street. Marcus had looked up the partial license plate, and while he couldn't confirm the identity, the car was a silver sedan matching the description of the HOA vendor's secondary vehicle, which was listed on their website alongside photos of their equipment fleet. The implication was clear and genuinely infuriating. The vendor had potentially sent someone to assess the street, seen that it had already been plowed, and decided not to bother doing anything until the following afternoon when they made their single useless pass, which meant they may have knowingly allowed the response window to lapse and then done a perfunctory appearance to technically claim they'd serviced the street, without actually providing any value. That bordered on fraud, both toward the HOA and toward the residents who paid HOA dues that funded the vendor contract. Marcus sent me the video clip. I copied it to a flash drive that I added to my evidence folder. The sticky note now said, "Evidence serious," because the energy had shifted considerably. Sunday night I organized everything I was bringing to the Monday board meeting. The HOA guidelines with Section 7.3b highlighted, the vendor contract with the performance penalty clause marked, the county's emergency declaration records, the signed collective response letter, the timeline document Tom Nguyen had put together, the video clip on the flash drive, and a one-page summary sheet I'd typed up that laid out the key points in plain language for anyone who hadn't read everything else. Marcus Webb was coming with me. Tom Nguyen was coming. Carol Marsh, who was still moving a little carefully after her fall but absolutely refused to miss this, was coming. The Delgados were sending their eldest, a sharp 23-year-old named Alina who just finished her first year of law school and was home for the winter, which felt like extraordinarily good timing. The Cresthaven HOA held its monthly meetings in the community room of a small clubhouse at the entrance to the neighborhood. It was a bland, functional space with a folding table at the front for the board members, rows of folding chairs for residents, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were in a police procedural. When our group arrived at 6:45, 15 minutes before the 7 o'clock start, the room was already more populated than I'd ever seen it for an HOA meeting. Word had gotten around. Virtually every household on Cresthaven Drive was represented, and a handful of homeowners from other streets in the neighborhood had shown up too because news travels, and people who'd had their own run-ins with Sue Bishop were curious about how this was going to go. Sue Bishop was already seated at the board table when we came in. She was wearing the puffer vest, naturally, and she had a folder in front of her, and the posture of someone preparing to deliver a verdict rather than participate in a discussion. She watched us file in and arrange ourselves in the front rows without her expression changing, which I'll give her credit for, because about 22 increasingly unhappy homeowners taking coordinated seats in your meeting would rattle most people. Dave Kowalski gave me a small nod when he sat down. Patricia Hinz looked anxious in the way of someone who knows a confrontation is coming and has already decided which side they want to end up on. The meeting opened with the standard routine: approval of minutes, treasurer's report, new business. Sue tried to move new business along quickly, listing the snow removal policy enforcement action near the bottom of the agenda in a slot that suggested it was routine rather than the entire reason the room was full. I waited until she read it out and then raised my hand and asked to be recognized to speak. Sue, to her credit or to her detriment depending on how you look at it, called on me. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I'd brought a portable Bluetooth speaker that I connected to my laptop, and I pulled up the video clip from Marcus's security camera on a laptop screen I'd borrowed from Alina Delgado because it was bigger than mine. I connected it to the community room's projector, which took about 90 uncomfortable seconds while Sue watched with the tight patience of someone deciding whether to object and thinking better of it. I showed the room the clip. I narrated it briefly. Here is the vendor's silver sedan parking at the entrance to Cresthaven Drive at approximately 5:17 p.m. on Thursday, January 14th. Here is the 4-hour contractual response window, which expired at approximately 3 p.m. Here is the vehicle sitting without entering the street. Here is the vehicle leaving without providing any service. Here is the HOA's vendor appearing the following afternoon to plow a road that had already been plowed the previous day by a privately hired contractor funded by the residents themselves. The room was very quiet during this, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Then I presented the documents. I handed copies to each board member. The Section 7(3)(b) subsection, the County Emergency Declaration records, the vendor contract penalty clause. I walked through the timeline. I was calm and factual because I'd learned that the best way to make someone look unreasonable is to be exceptionally reasonable yourself. When I finished, I sat down, and Elena Delgado stood up. She was composed and clear in a way that law school had apparently cultivated in her already, and she went directly to the legal meat of it. She explained that under Section 7(3)(b), the fines issued to Cresthaven Drive residents were invalid because the vendor's failure was not protected by any documented natural emergency declaration. She noted that the county's Level 2 snow emergency, specifically, did not meet the HOA guidelines definition of emergency conditions. She said that accordingly, the HOA had no lawful basis to assess the fines, and that all notices should be rescinded immediately. She also noted that under the vendor contract, the HOA was obligated to pursue the performance penalty clause, and that the recovered funds should be used to reimburse residents for the costs of the private contractor, which she had documentation of thanks to the Venmo receipts Marcus had collected from everyone. She sat down. The room was still very quiet. Dave Kowalski was reading his copies of the documents. Patricia Hines was reading hers. Sue Bishop was not reading hers. She was looking at the table in front of her with an expression that I can only describe as a person doing very fast interior calculations. Sue said that the board would need time to review the documents and that a decision would be communicated within the standard 10-business-day response window. Dave Kowalski said, and I want to be precise here because the moment deserves accuracy, that he didn't think 10 business days was necessary. He said the documents appeared clear and that he was prepared to move to rescind the fine notices immediately as a motion to the board. Patricia Hines seconded it before Sue could respond. The vote was 2-1 to rescind all fines. Sue voted against, which she had every right to do, but 2-1 was a majority and the fines were gone. The room made a sound like a collective exhale. I felt my shoulders drop about 2 inches, but we weren't done, and Sue knew it, which is probably why what happened next happened. The meeting broke up into the informal standing around portion that always follows HOA meetings, where neighbors talk and sometimes the board mingles and information gets exchanged in the messy human way that formal proceedings don't allow for. I was talking to Tom Nguyen and Carol Marsh when Marcus came over to me with something on his phone again, and the look on his face told me it was important. While Marcus had been going back through the security footage from earlier in the week, he'd found something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the snowplow situation. Marcus's camera had a timestamp archive going back 90 days, and about 6 weeks prior, on a weekday afternoon, it had captured a vehicle Marcus didn't recognize parked in front of the Nguyen property. The vehicle belonged, according to a sticker on the back window that Marcus had zoomed in on and traced to a business, to a landscaping company. A landscaping company that Marcus knew for a fact was not the HOA's approved vendor, because it was a company he competed with directly in his own landscaping business, and he'd seen their truck around the neighborhood before. 2 people had gotten out of the truck, walked the common area between the street and the sidewalk along a stretch of Cresthaven Drive, done something with what appeared to be aerating equipment, gotten back in, and left. The whole thing took about 20 minutes. Marcus had asked around quietly and confirmed that nobody in the neighborhood had hired this company privately. There was no documentation in the HOA's records, which Dave Kowalski had access to and had quickly checked, of any approved work order for aeration on Cresthaven Drive in that period. What it looked like, and what it increasingly appeared to be after Dave Kowalski did some more digging over the next 2 days, was that Sue Bishop had been contracting HOA-managed maintenance work to unauthorized vendors and potentially billing the HOA for work that was either never done or done by companies that had no approved contract relationship with the HOA. The aeration job that Marcus had footage of. The HOA's maintenance ledger showed a $400 payment to the approved landscaping contractor for seasonal common area maintenance including aeration during that exact billing period. But the approved contractor, when Dave called them, had no record of performing aeration work on Cresthaven Drive that month. They'd done some work on the adjacent Parkview section, but not Cresthaven. That $400 had apparently gone somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. Dave Kowalski contacted Patricia Hins Wednesday evening. By Thursday morning, they'd pulled the maintenance ledger for the past 18 months and identified 6 separate line items totaling just under $3,800 for work they couldn't verify had been performed by the contractor's build. 3 of those line items were in periods covered by Marcus's security camera archive, and in 2 of the 3 cases, the footage showed either no work being performed during the relevant period or work being performed by vehicles belonging to vendors other than those listed in the billing. Dave Kowalski called me Thursday afternoon. He told me what he'd found. He also told me that he and Patricia Hins had decided this was beyond the scope of what the board could handle internally, and that they were going to contact the county's HOA oversight office, and given the financial nature of the discrepancies, quite possibly the police. He sounded like a man who'd been quietly unhappy for a long time and had finally found both the reason and the permission to do something about it. I told him I thought he was making the right call. I told him I'd make sure Marcus preserved all the relevant security footage in its original format and could provide it to investigators if needed. Dave thanked me and said he was sorry it had come to this, which I believed, because Dave had never been malicious, just conflict avoidant in a way that had allowed someone else's malice to operate unchecked. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning when the temperature had finally crept back above 20 degrees and the street was looking more like a normal January than a polar expedition, I was in my kitchen making eggs when I saw an unfamiliar car park in front of Sue Bishop's house. Then another one. One of them was a marked police cruiser. The other was an unmarked sedan that had county government plates. I didn't go stand on my porch to watch because that felt intrusive, and also because I didn't need to. My kitchen window provided a perfectly adequate view of the relevant portion of the street, and I was making eggs and coincidentally standing near the window for the entire duration of whatever was happening across the way. I saw 2 people in plainclothes go to Sue's door with the uniformed officer. I saw the door open. I saw a conversation that lasted about 10 minutes with the participants visible in the doorway. I saw Sue Bishop's face from a distance, and even at that distance and without being able to hear anything, her body language had shifted from the rigid forward-leaning certainty I'd seen at the board meeting to something much smaller and more defensive. Nobody was arrested that morning. That's not how these things work immediately, at least not in this case, which started as a civil HOA matter and had to be properly investigated before any criminal charges could be contemplated. But the investigative process that began that Saturday morning moved with what I'd describe as commendable purpose. By the end of January, the county HOA oversight office had formally opened a financial misconduct investigation against the Cresthaven HOA board, with Sue Bishop named as the subject. By mid-February, an audit firm appointed by the Oversight Office had gone through 18 months of HOA financial records and identified approximately $6,200 in payments that could not be substantiated by legitimate work orders, vendor confirmations, or any documentation showing services were actually received. Sue Bishop retained a lawyer, which was her right. Her lawyer's initial position was that the discrepancies were clerical errors and bookkeeping issues, rather than intentional misconduct. This argument lost significant credibility when the audit firm pointed out that several of the questionable payments had been authorized by single-signature sign-off that, under the HOA's own bylaws, required dual board approval for amounts over $500. Sue had been approving these payments unilaterally, in excess of her authorization, for transactions that benefited an unofficial vendor and resulted in payments to the approved vendor's account being rerouted in at least 2 documented cases. The rerouting part was what turned this from an administrative irregularity into something considerably more serious. By late February, the county prosecutor's office had gotten involved following a referral from the Oversight Office. Sue Bishop was charged with 2 counts of theft by deception and 1 count of misuse of fiduciary authority, all misdemeanors to start, but with the potential to escalate depending on how the full audit concluded. She entered a not guilty plea, and the case proceeded through the court process, which is slow and methodical and not the exciting television version. In the meantime, the Cresthaven HOA had to be restructured because it literally couldn't function with 1 board member under criminal investigation and 2 others who had been complicit through inaction, if not through active participation. Dave Kowalski and Patricia Hinz both resigned, which I thought was the honest thing to do even if they hadn't been personally corrupt. The neighborhood held an emergency election in early March, after the snow had largely retreated and people could walk to the community room without serious risk, and elected a 3-person board of which Marcus Webb was 1 member, Carol Marsh was another, and a retired attorney named Harold Spence from the Parkview section was the 3rd. Harold Spence rewrote the HOA's vendor oversight process in about 3 weeks. The new process required dual approval for all payments over $250, mandatory video documentation of completed work for any job over $500, and an annual independent audit of the maintenance ledger. Simple, sensible stuff that apparently nobody had bothered to implement before because nobody had thought they needed to until they did. The vendor contract was also reviewed and renegotiated. The new contract had stricter performance standards, a lower force majeure threshold that required actual documented state or federal emergency declarations, rather than just level 2 snow emergencies, and an escalating penalty structure that kicked in at the 2-hour mark after a missed response window rather than the 4-hour mark. The new vendor, who was actually a larger and better resourced company than the previous one, bid competitively because Harold Spence knew how to write a request for proposals, and the previous contract had apparently been renewed on a handshake basis for the last 2 cycles. The $6,200 identified by the audit as improperly disbursed was partially recovered through the criminal process, which is slow, and partially recovered through Sue Bishop's homeowners bond, which the HOA had and which most people, including me, hadn't known about. It's an insurance product specifically designed for situations where an HOA officer causes financial harm through misconduct, and in this case, it paid out relatively quickly once the audit documentation was provided. The recovered funds went back into the HOA's operating reserve, and the new board voted to use a portion of them to temporarily reduce quarterly assessments for all residents, which amounted to a modest but real credit on everyone's next bill. The Venmo reimbursement for Dale's Plow job came through in early March as well. The new board had reviewed the documentation Marcus had assembled, confirmed the legitimate claim under the vendor contract penalty clause, and issued checks to all participating residents for their share of the cost. My check was for $73, which wasn't exactly life-changing money, but it wasn't about the money. It was about the principle of the thing being correctly resolved. Tom Nguyen's mother, for anyone wondering, was fine. Her furnace had a faulty igniter that a technician fixed the same day Tom got there, and she'd been using her electric space heater in the meantime like a sensible person and was perfectly warm the whole time. She told Tom she didn't understand what all the fuss was about, which made Tom laugh even as he was explaining the situation to her. Carol Marsh's hip healed up without any lasting damage, which was a relief. She did consult an attorney about the HOA's liability for the inadequate sidewalk maintenance, and the attorney's opinion was that she had a legitimate claim, but that pursuing it would be more trouble than it was worth given the small damages and the cost of litigation. She declined to pursue it, but the new board, when they heard about it, proactively addressed the sidewalk maintenance gaps in the new vendor contract and added a specific provision about de-icing treatments following storm events that the old contract hadn't included. Sue Bishop's criminal case eventually resolved with a plea agreement in late spring. She pled guilty to one count of misuse of fiduciary authority, a misdemeanor, with the other charges dismissed. She was sentenced to 18 months probation, ordered to pay restitution of $4,000 to the HOA, and removed from any HOA-related position for a period of 5 years under the terms of the plea. She also paid her own attorney fees, which by all accounts were considerably more than the amount she'd misappropriated, which is a kind of justice all its own. She moved out of the neighborhood by summer. I don't know where she went, and I don't particularly care. What I know is that the Cresthaven HOA is genuinely better now in ways that go beyond the structural improvements Marcus and Carol and Harold put in place. The neighborhood group chat, which used to be primarily a venue for complaint about Sue's enforcement actions and passive-aggressive reminders about recycling bin placement schedules, is now mostly used for things like sharing photos of people's dogs in the snow, organizing the spring block party, and occasionally someone asking if anyone has a good recommendation for a plumber. The board meetings, which I now actually attend, are brief and productive and sometimes end early. I have never in my life been happy about an HOA meeting ending early before this year. Marcus Webb gave his landscaping business a small boost from all of it, partly because he was now on the HOA board and partly because several neighbors, having seen his competence and integrity up close, hired him for work they'd previously given to other companies. He hired Dale as a seasonal subcontractor for the following winter, which seemed like a satisfying full-circle development. Dale was pleased about it and sent Marcus a text that said, "Appreciate the referral. That HOA situation sounds wild," which was accurate. I finished painting my back deck in the spring, which had nothing to do with any of this but needed to get done, and felt symbolically appropriate as a season change activity. The cedar came out looking good. The winter had been interesting in ways I hadn't anticipated and stressful in ways I could have done without, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in having been the person who read the fine print when it mattered. Here's the thing about HOA situations that I've come to understand more clearly after living through this one. The Sue Bishops of the world operate on the assumption that the people they're dealing with won't read the documents, won't organize, won't push back, and won't know their rights. They're often correct about this. Most people receive a fine notice, feel a mix of outrage and helplessness, and end up paying it even when they shouldn't, because fighting it feels like too much work, and the amount is calibrated to be just small enough to make litigation seem disproportionate. The whole system works on compliance through exhaustion. What breaks it is when one person reads carefully, then maybe two people. Then a street full of people who have all had enough and are standing in each other's kitchens comparing fine notices and realizing they all got the same letter, and the letter doesn't actually have a legal leg to stand on. The snow was what made it urgent. If this had been a dispute about mailbox post colors or the aesthetic standards for window curtains, I might have grumbled and moved on like I had before. But when the street is buried, when a neighbor's medical appointment is at stake, when an 80-year-old woman's furnace is questionable and her son can't get to her, the priorities become very clear very fast. And once those priorities were clear, everything else followed logically. We helped each other. We documented it. We organized. We showed up. And when it turned out that the person fining us for helping each other had been quietly stealing from the same community she was claiming to protect, the documents proved it, the camera footage proved it, and the legal system did what legal systems are supposed to do when properly presented with evidence. I think about that Tuesday evening when the snow started. How quiet it was at first. How I stood at my window with a cup of tea watching the flakes come down and thinking naively that it would be fine, the vendor would come, the road would be cleared, life would proceed normally. By Wednesday morning, everything was white and still, and the normal mechanisms weren't working, and a street full of neighbors had to figure it out together. That's actually the part of this I want to remember. Not Sue Bishop's face at the board meeting, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy that. Not the certified mail and the evidence folder and the subsection 7.3b gotcha moment, though all of that was deeply satisfying. What I want to remember is 22 households chipping into a Venmo to get Dale and his orange truck down our street. Tom Nguyen tearing out of his driveway the second the road was clear, engine revving, headed to his mother's place. Carol Marsh making her dialysis appointment. The sound of the salt spreader at the back of Dale's truck, rattling as he worked down the length of our street, and people coming out on their porches to watch because, after a day and a half of feeling stuck and cold and unhelped, something was finally happening. That moment, right there in the cold, with our breath clouding in the January air and our street finally getting cleared by a guy we'd collectively hired, and a community that had decided not to just wait around for institutions to do what they were supposed to do, that was the moment I want to remember. The fine notices, the board meetings, the investigation and the charges and the eventual resolution, those came later and they mattered and they were necessary. But they came from that moment, from people taking care of each other when the official systems failed. The next winter was quiet on Cresthaven Drive. The new vendor showed up within 2 hours of any significant accumulation, sand and salt ahead of time, trucks running the length of the street twice to make sure the pavement was clear. Marcus monitored the response times personally and documented them, and they were good, consistently good, because the contract now had real teeth. The sidewalks got treated. The common areas got maintained on schedule. The HOA bills were accurate, and the work matched the charges, and nobody received a fine notice for anything that wasn't genuinely their responsibility. It snowed a lot that second winter. Big storms, multiple events, the kind of sustained cold that turns January into something you endure rather than enjoy. But Cresthaven Drive stayed clear, stayed connected, stayed functional. And in January of that second winter, almost exactly a year after the storm that started all of this, we had our neighborhood's first actual winter block party. It was Marcus's idea. He set up fire pits in the cul-de-sac. People brought food and drinks. The kids built a genuinely impressive snow fort against the Delgado's fence, and someone brought a portable speaker that played music that was probably more appropriate for summer, but nobody cared. Tom Nguyen's mother came. Tom had picked her up, wrapped her in a blanket, and installed her in a folding chair near the biggest fire pit with a cup of hot chocolate. And she sat there all evening telling anyone who'd listened that her son had made the whole situation out to be much worse than it was, which made Tom smile every time she said it. Carol Marsh was there, moving without any trace of the hip trouble that had worried me back in January. She'd made a chili that people were having seconds and thirds of and quietly claiming was the best they'd ever had. Dale drove by on his way to another job, saw the party, and slowed down to wave. Marcus jogged over to the truck window and shook his hand and said something that made Dale laugh. He drove on, salt spreader silent for once, the back of the truck disappearing around the corner at the end of the street. I stood near the fire, warm enough to have unzipped my coat, watching the neighborhood be itself. Watching the thing that had almost been broken by a woman with a puffer vest and too much authority and too little accountability be fully, genuinely, satisfyingly intact. The HOA was a tool again, the way it was always supposed to be. A boring, useful, occasionally annoying tool for coordinating the shared parts of shared living. Not a weapon. Not a revenue source for someone's private arrangements. Not a machine for grinding down people who didn't know their rights. Just a neighborhood taking care of itself. Which, when I thought about how it had started, was exactly what we'd been doing all along. I finished my coffee, zipped my coat back up because the wind was picking up, and went to get a bowl of Carol's chili. It was, as advertised, exceptionally good.